Welcome back to our final lecture on the decolonization process of Africa. Today we're going to study the Belgian Congo because I think it provides a very interesting study on how colonization was handled, how it could have been handled differently. And I think the Belgian Congo is an area that often is forgotten about in the study of Africa. We spend a lot of time on South Africa, as we did in this class. Spend a lot of time on West Africa for the slave trade, maybe even East Africa, primarily though on East Africa for its amazing wildlife and landscapes. If you've ever seen The Lion King, you've seen East Africa, at least what it generally is expected to look like. But the Belgian Congo is different for a number of reasons. Number one, it is kind of bad and dirty history in the sense that there are some horrific things that happened in the Belgian Congo, and we need to talk about them. I mean, unfortunately, they happened. We need to understand them. And the Belgian Congo, not only as an example of horrific European exploitation, also, right before decolonization, seemed to be a leading example of how decolonization could be done well. The Congo had some of the highest literacy rates in all of Africa, and it seemed a nation poised for success, immense natural resources, and a fairly well-educated elite. And then, in the transition of power between Europeans and Africans, something went wrong. And as a result of this, the nation not only experienced incredible pressure, but really has had one of the worst track records of a nation in human history. In fact, it is near the bottom of every human development index. It's near the bottom of every economic ranking in the world, and it is the site to one of the largest genocides, certainly in African history and possibly in world history. Where did it all go wrong? That is the story that we need to tell today. But in order to tell that story, we really need to go back to the beginning. Now, you'll remember when we talked about Portuguese exploration of Africa, they bumped into a group of people called the Congo, which typically in historical resources, we refer to them as Kongo rather than Congo, which is the name of the river, that occupied the area around the Congo River. And this Congo Empire began trading slaves to the Portuguese. And this occurs all the way back in the late early 1500s. Now, the Congolese Empire eventually began to collapse in the late 1500s, early 1600s, primarily because of the demographic damage they were doing to their own nation because of slavery. Slavery, remember, had a catastrophic impact not only on those who were taken to the New World, that was certainly damaging, but it had a catastrophic impact on the people that remained behind. Genetic diversity reduced, numbers of people reduced, and really just became very difficult to organize political states with slavery involved. And so the Congo state collapsed in the early 1600s, and the entirety of the Congo Basin really remained without centralized rule from the 1600s all the way through the 1800s. Now, in the 1800s, remember, we've talked extensively about why Africa began to be appealing to many European colonial powers. Remember, they'd kind of come to realize that no longer did they need to find areas they could settle and create a farm and create settlements that way, but instead they could simply extract resources. Again, we've talked about this extensively this week, so we don't need to go into too much detail about what was going on here and exactly how this process worked. But remember that that's going on, and that is changing European attitudes towards Central Africa. Now to enter one of the most controversial figures in all of European history, King Leopold II of Belgium. First, let's explain Belgium. Belgium was created in 1814 by the English as an effective barrier to keep peace between European nations. Actually, Belgium was created originally to keep Germany safe from the French, and in reality, Belgium actually served to keep France safe from the Germans, not once but twice during the World Wars. So Belgium did do its job, even if that wasn't the originally intended thing that it was going to do. It was going to protect the other way around. But Belgium was effectively a region that was a mashup of the Netherlands and the Dutch culture and French culture. In fact, the official language of Belgium is French, although they have a number of cultural traits shared with the Dutch. The main difference is not only their language, but their religion. Belgium was traditionally Catholic, the Netherlands traditionally Protestant. So that's really the big dividing line. And the northern parts of the Netherlands were the areas that rebelled successfully against Spain, and the southern parts were the parts that took much longer to leave Spanish control. So that's just a history of Belgium. Not super important for us to understand, but I thought you guys would like to know that as we talk about Belgium a lot today. Belgium's King Leopold II, much like the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, looked around the world in the 1860s and 1870s and thought to himself, Belgium really is lacking in colonial power. And their neighbors to the north, the Netherlands, actually did have extensive colonial holdings. Not only did the Dutch have holdings in Southeast Asia, Indonesia as we call it today, or the Dutch East Indies as they were called at that time, but they also controlled areas of South America. So Belgium, in many ways, felt that it was behind things. Even Denmark had a colony over in Iceland. Come on, Belgium was behind the curve, okay, along with the Germans. So while the Germans and the Belgians were looking for territory that they could acquire. Now, Leopold, as he was looking at maps of Africa, noticed that there was a gap between English territory and Portuguese territory. In fact, there was about a 20-mile gap, or 30-mile gap, depending on whose map you were looking at, and Leopold decided that he wanted to take control of that gap. The important thing about it was on the Congo River, which meant that if you could control that gap, then you could expand into the Congo River and create a large state in the interior that still had access to the ocean where its resources could be used and extracted. In fact, by the way, if you look at a modern map of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, if you Google it right now, and you look at the border, you'll see that there's a huge mass of the Congo, and very, very little of it touches the ocean. Okay, just a little kind of peninsula of land that sticks out and touches the ocean that kind of walks its way along the Congo River out there. But Leopold realized this, and he decided he wanted to take that area. Now, he couldn't take it as Belgium. In fact, the Belgian parliament was really not all that interested in taking territory, was not really that interested in colonization. So Leopold actually decided to do this on a personal venture. Now, he made contact with one of the most famous African explorers. In fact, he's probably an African explorer that you have heard of, and, interestingly enough, you probably even know his most famous quotation, and that is Henry Stanley. And Stanley had gone into Africa looking for another great and famous African explorer, David Livingstone. David Livingstone, of course, had gone into Africa and was exploring, was a missionary, and he had been gone for a number of years, and Stanley went in after him, and upon their meeting, Stanley said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And it's a very famous line. You probably heard of it before. And eventually Livingstone had gone and died. Stanley, who was a Welsh American, came back to Europe and shared many of his findings, and he was very popular. He went back and worked for the British, but the British decided not to rehire him after his exploration of the Congo. Britain was involved in a number of internal political problems with Ireland, problems with South Africa, problems with India, problems with Canada, the list goes on. And instead of finding interest from Britain, Stanley began to look around to other locations in Africa. Certainly the French were interested to some extent, but the Belgians, specifically King Leopold II, was very interested. And Leopold II offered Stanley a massive salary to return to the Congo region, establish a company colony, and to begin to develop the area for resource extraction. And that's exactly what happens. Stanley would go and he would begin to lay the beginnings of the Congo Free State. And it's a free state because it's actually not a nation. It's not owned by a nation. It's effectively owned by a company. But that company was run by Leopold II of Belgium. So while not technically a Belgian colony, it was effectively a Belgian colony. Now, Stanley, when he got there, went about creating several important cities, most important of which were Leopoldville, which I wonder where he got that name, and Stanleyville. Okay, so Stanley, definitely not a particularly inspired namer of things, but he did establish a colony there along the Congo River, and this colony is going to prove to be one of the most profitable in all of Africa. And this is for a number of reasons, but there's one big one. So let's go over the large number of reasons first. Number one, the Belgian Congo has one of the world's largest rainforests with some of the largest biodiversity of any place on the planet. Okay, that's useful. And you might wonder, what is that useful for? Okay, what does it matter how many snakes and plants and things live in the Congo? Well, remember, this is the late 1800s. By this time, we've had the scientific revolution. We've even had medical revolutions. And these plants are actually valuable for medicinal properties. And so the Congo is actually an early hotbed of plant exploration. Another thing that the Congo has going for it is a huge population. This population could be used to work. This population could be used to grow bananas, which is something that they did. This population could be used to extract other resources, so it's got a large population. Finally, it has almost unlimited amounts of mineral wealth, and it has difficult to get mineral wealth in easy to get locations, relatively. I mean, you got to get up the Congo River, which is hard, and you've got to get through the rainforest, which is hard, but still it's close to the surface. You don't have to mine miles and miles of rock and set up extensive infrastructure to get to it. It's surface level. Okay, Congo is famous for having some of the only surface level uranium mines in the world, which I don't think you'd want to work there, but from a perspective of an industrial society, that's nice. So you can get uranium much easier than, say, the methods that were used in Colorado, where sometimes uranium deposits were miles deep and you had to go get them. Very, very difficult to do. Whereas the Belgians, I really didn't have that problem whatsoever in the Congo. The most valuable thing about the Congo, it turned out, however, was its climate and its ability to grow rubber. Rubber is actually from a tree. You might not know this. It's actually called the latex tree, which is why the most common form of rubber in most people's lives is latex. Latex actually refers to the fact that it is natural rubber. There's both natural and artificial rubber. And you might think to yourself, oh, clearly I use artificial rubber. Probably not. Artificial rubber is actually very poor quality. If you have a rubber thing that breaks down quickly, that might be artificial rubber. But if you have something that is nice and made of rubber, it is probably actually rubber that came out of a tree. So if you have nice waterproof rubber boots, probably originally from this sap of the latex tree that comes out. That's where rubber comes from. So it's actually an organic product, which, you know, like I can't think of much other than like rubber and oil that we think of that's less organic, right? Rubber, it's like it's on the gaskets of your car, it's in your boots, it's on the bottoms of every single one of your shoes, right? It's not something that we typically think of, this came from a tree, but it did. You know, rubber is very common and it comes off of trees, latex trees. Now, latex trees are original and thrive in South America, but they can also be grown in other places. And they had been transplanted already successfully to Southeast Asia, where the French were already really getting huge returns from their cultivation of these rubber trees. And they're moved into the Congo basin of Africa, and they prove to really like that environment as well. And so quickly, the Belgians, or the workers of this Congo Free State, begin growing rubber in massive quantities all across this colony. Unfortunately, number one, the process of getting latex out of the trees and then refining it into usable rubber is very difficult and led to many Africans being forced into labor. And the Belgians did not use a normal wage system. They didn't pay people for their work. They effectively required them to work to live. And many villages were captured and kidnapped and effectively brought in as slave labor. Now, they weren't called slaves. All right, the Belgians would never call them slaves, but they were effectively slaves. They were being paid almost nothing. They were being barely fed, and they were being moved long distances to come and work in these facilities and these fields to get the rubber. Even more horrific was the system of punishments meted out to the Africans. The Belgians, for some reason, had this idea that Africans were literally subhuman, which we would see, of course, again later on in Nazi ideology. But remember that this was not unique just to the Nazis, unfortunately. Much of Europe has this problem. And so the Belgians really mistreated their African subjects, if there's no other really better way to say it. They're certainly not citizens. And the punishment for doing things like not meeting your quota would include having your own hand chopped off. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of images of Congolese with their arms chopped off, their hands chopped off. Really horrific images of these poor people that were abused by the Belgians to attempt to get them to work harder and faster. Ritual murders, the Belgians would kill children to force the parents to work harder and faster and do different things like this. And really just horrible treatment. And for a long time, approximately 12 years, the Belgians effectively did this without anybody reporting on them. The rubber came out. Nobody really knew where it came from. There was a couple of rumors of some bad practices going on in the Congo, and nobody really had much information on any of this stuff. And finally, an English journalist traveled through Belgian Congo, and he was appalled by what he saw. And he went back and he wrote a very famous novel called The Heart of Darkness, which is really quite the interesting read. It's very dark. very dark, very heavy. But if you really want to get a good grasp of what was going on in the Belgian Congo, read The Heart of Darkness. It's absolutely worth your time. It is a great piece of literature because it really unleashes upon you what was being done. The story generally follows this trip up the river, up the Congo River, and there's these continuous experiences with everyone on the ship, and the ship is in relief of a British commander that's been sent deep into the jungle to maintain one of these rubber production facilities. And as they go up the river and all of these events happen, the crew and the passengers slowly descend into madness, and that's kind of what the entire book is about. It's about the allegory of these people arrive in Africa and they seem to go mad, and they're willing to brutalize the Africans to get what they want, and eventually they wind up at the camp of this guy, and he is turned into a complete madman, and he's sending cannibals to come and attempt to eat the passengers on the boat. That's kind of how it ends. And again, if that sounds interesting to you, I really encourage you to look it up. But it's a classic, not just because it's a fairly interesting story, and by the way, a number of movies have been made over that very same concept, but it also reflects the reality of Congo, and it was just bad. Horrible, horrible. Probably the most horrific of European exploitation in Africa, and that is saying something. There were some other horrific exploitations in Africa, but this probably takes the cake. Both England and, of course, the United States are outraged with the printing of this article. European and American journalists begin to get into the Congo and document the absolutely horrific situation that's going on there. And growing international pressure is mounted on Leopold to pull out of the Congo or to reestablish the Congo. It became apparent that Leopold had his own personal army in the Congo called the Force Publique. Remember that the Belgians speak French, and these guys were the ones that were doing all the hatchet work, chopping people's hands off, killing babies to force the Africans to work harder. And eventually Belgium was forced to take control of the colony and take personal responsibility. Because at first, Belgium and even Leopold said, well, look, it's not a problem, it's a company that's running this, not us. And the United States and England said, no way, I don't think so. You guys are in charge. You guys might not be taking responsibility for this, but you are absolutely responsible for it. So I don't care what the name on the title says. I don't care who technically owns Belgium. You effectively own Belgium. So you need to go and you need to deal with this problem. And so Leopold was not deposed. He wasn't really punished in any way, but effectively Belgium stepped in and said, okay, we're gonna try and fix these practices. And so some of the most horrific practices are slowly phased out. Not fast enough, if you want my personal opinion, but they are phased out. With that happening, there are some serious economic developments in the Congo. Belgium did, to its credit, attempt to develop Belgium well after this point. Not only did rubber production continue with slightly more humane methods of getting the rubber out of the trees, but there was also extensive logging done in Belgium Congo. There's also significant mining starting to be done. The main thing that the Belgians were after at first was copper. And I think I mentioned in the decolonization lecture that copper, of course, during the electrical revolution was incredibly important. And so we have huge quantities of copper, tons and tons and tons of the stuff, leaving the Congo and going back to Belgium. But again, one of the problems is that those natural resources that are being sold, that money is not going back into the country. And again, to illustrate that, think about the United States. If a person in the United States finds a huge gold deposit and sells the gold, they start up a mining operation and they sell the gold, that money goes back into the United States. It goes back into the pockets of the man or the woman, the company that discovered the gold, and they give that gold to their workers, and those workers pay for everything in their local economies. They buy food for their families. They go and get their cars fixed at the local garages. They go buy refrigerators at the local furniture stores or outlets. And so the natural resource benefited the country that created it, and many people got wealthy and they saved money and they invested in the stock market and all this stuff, right? The money flowing into the American economy, very good. The Belgian Congo, on the other hand, the Congolese mined the copper out for next to nothing or nothing sometimes, and that was it. There was no wealth generated in the country itself. It was shipped out, it was sold by a Belgian, who then goes and develops Belgium, not the Congo. And that's the problem. There's all of this extraction, and the Congolese are working hard and doing all these things. Excuse me. Not corona, I promise. They're doing all these things, but at the end of the day, they're not benefiting from them. When the world wars rolled around, the Congo was actually surprisingly involved in World War I. A German force in East Africa actually invaded Congo, and the Force Publique, the force that used to be the personal army of Leopold, which was transferred into a normal Belgian army regiment, actually pushed back on the Germans and counterattacked with the help of the British, and eventually forced their way into German East Africa, of which Belgium took some of that territory and added on to the Belgian Congo. In World War II, the Belgian Congo was supported by South Africa and supported South Africa. In fact, the Congolese forces, the Belgian Congolese forces, actually served with the British in Siam. So they actually fought the Japanese. So African levies from the Congo fought in Siam against the Japanese. Again, that's kind of crazy. I've seen some pictures out there of a Indian soldier in World War II uniform, kind of with a funny look on his face, saying, "Wait, so I have to go fight the Japanese in Siam because a German guy invaded Poland," right? There's kind of this funny sequence of events that eventually gets these people from all over the world into World War I and World War II. But the Belgians and their Congolese troops served with great honor and great ferocity in the world wars, and absolutely deserve our commendation for that. With the end of World War II, the Belgians realized that, the sunset of empire was upon them. They were going to need to eventually get out of the Congo. But for the first 15 years after the war, they kind of acted like that wasn't going to happen. On a positive note, though, a lot of things improve for the native Congolese. First of all, Belgium invests heavily in a public schools network for the Belgian Congo. And so by 1960, more than 3 times more Belgian Congolese are getting educations than they were in 1945. So the native people are getting much better educations because of Belgian efforts. In fact, the literacy rate was the best in all of Africa, including Northern Africa, although excluding South Africa. And the wealth of the average Congolese was much higher than all of their neighbors. There was not even an official racial policy. So technically, Africans and whites could live in the same places. They could marry each other. There wasn't anything like apartheid in South Africa. Now, in real terms, there was an economic barrier between the Congolese and the Belgians. But in law terms, there were no barriers. There were no problems. So all of this indicates that Belgium was doing a fine job in their colony. And when they left, it would probably be good. Except it wasn't good at all. The educated elite of the Congo, especially those that had been to Europe and the United States and had come back, began clamoring for their own nations, rightly so. The United States and the Soviet Union began putting intense pressure on Belgium, saying, "Hey, you need to start decolonization. It's been 15 years. It's time to get the process started." Belgium submitted a plan to the United States and the Soviet Union and the United Nations saying, okay, over the next 30 years, we are going to decolonize the Belgian Congo. So from 1960 to 1990, we are going to do that whole clutch versus gas metaphor I gave you last time. We're going to hold up on the clutch, white administration. We're going to push down on the gas, black administration. In our economy, in our government, in our military, and we're going to transition, and everything's going to be good. And maybe that would have been the case in a perfect world, but instead, in 1960, the Belgians had a bad financial year and said, you know what, nope, we're out. And boom, 1 year after telling the superpowers, yeah, sure, we'll decolonize, the Belgians are just gone. Gone. The Congolese are on their own. Good luck. And, of course, what happened, but the only organized part of the country took power, and that was the Force Publique, led by black officers who weren't interested in democracy, they were interested in power. The most famous of these officers was a man by the name of Mobutu. Mobutu ends up as dictator of the Democratic Republic of the Congo all the way from the 1960s through the 1990s. In fact, he renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo Zaire, Z-A-I-R-E, for most of this period to help two things. Number one, to distance it from its Belgian roots and to distinguish it from the Republic of the Congo, which is literally just north of it, which can be certainly confusing. There's a Republic of the Congo and a Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's confusing. Mobutu drove out Europeans. More than 95% of the Europeans in the country in 1960 were driven out by 1970. And with these Europeans' losses, the economic future of the Congo fell. The management of many of these Congolese companies fell into complete disrepair. Some of the best schools in the entire nation were shut down because many of these whites worked in the schools. Missionaries were driven out who had been educating those people in rural areas. And Mobutu was going to stay in power for nearly 40 years. He didn't die until 1998, I believe, if I remember correctly. Congo is then going to be the source of a number of racial genocides. A number of different tribal groups and people groups in the Congo are going to begin fighting against each other, and Mobutu does nothing to help this. In fact, he arms certain groups to fight other groups, but of course, as is oftentimes the case, when one group wins, they begin attacking others, starting another partial civil war, and the eastern sections of Congo have almost never been controlled by the western sections of Congo for the last 60 or at this point, 60 years. 60 years. So the country has been torn apart and wrecked, and it has one of the world's largest poverty rates, has one of the world's lowest literacy rates. It is, in many ways, at a very big disadvantage to the rest of Africa. And again, in 1960, before the Belgians left, it was one of the leading nations in Africa. Again, what happened? European mismanagement and military control. The military was organized, and it was all that was organized, and so it took power. Now, is there hope for the Congo? Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, it's not the Congolese people that are the problem. It's their unpreparedness. And why were they unprepared? They're unprepared because the Europeans didn't take the time to finish their education, to enable them to rule themselves. Instead, they're being controlled by military strongmen who have no interest in letting the African people decide things for themselves. What does the future hold for the Congo? I can't tell you that. Hopefully good things. And hopefully, again, as Christians, hopefully the Congo is an opportunity for American missionaries, because missionaries throughout much of African history have had a very good effect on the native Africans. They aid with education. They aid with getting rid of practices that are dangerous to the Africans. Now, that doesn't mean turning them into Americans. That's not required, certainly. But there are practices that, are unsanitary that many missionaries can help Africans get over. They can give them the education they need to advance into the future. They can give women the stability in their homes that they need through religion and through the loss of vices of their husband. And there can be a powerful stabilizing effect. And hopefully that's what happens in the next years. Whether it'll happen or not, well, that I can't tell you.